Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, particularly with Father Sean and with Dr. Ruse. You're going to hear some great things from them today. My job is to kind of set the table for our conversation. And it's fortuitous that we're having this conference today, because in Rome, at the Vatican, right now, the Center for Research and Anthropology of Vocations is having a conference too. And they're discussing man and woman and the image of God for an anthropology of all vocations. And you might have heard that just yesterday, Pope Francis, in his preliminary remarks as they were kicking off this conference, referred to gender ideology as today's worst danger because it cancels our differences. He says it's an ugly ideology because when you erase differences, you erase humanity. Now, Pope Francis has been in the news on this gender ideology issue for some other reasons in the past, and it usually has to do with the pastoral side. You know, he sits down with the transgender community and washes their feet and has meals with them. And really it's those two things, the truth about our human anthropology and our compassion for people who are struggling with gender dysphoria, that really defines who we are as Catholics. And so that's where my portion of the speaking this morning is going to be directed. Now, I am a lawyer, as Joe mentioned, but I'm not really here to talk about the law. There's a chapter about that in the book if you want to read it. I'm here as a Catholic dad who is just intensely interested in spreading the truth about this issue to help my kids and my grandkids and all of yours as well be able to have discussions about this issue of gender ideology in compassionate, loving, truthful ways. And so in order to do that, we actually need to set some groundwork principles before we get into gender ideology. First, what is love? Second, what is truth? And third, what is the Church's vision of the human body, a human ecology, as opposed to what culture thinks about the human body? And once we kind of establish that groundwork, we can start to dig into gender ideology. And I'll do that at a high level, and then Father Sean and Dr. Ruse will dive much deeper into that. So starting with love, it's easy to think about love the way that we're taught in the media and from Hollywood, that love is just this mushy, sentimental thing, and it's all about the feelings that I have towards someone else. But that's not how the Catholic Church talks about love at all. The Catechism says to love is to will the good of another. To love is to will the good of another. And so that has three components, love does. First, it has to be an intentional act. It's not a feeling at all. It's something that we do intentionally. Second, love always focuses on someone else. It's looking to the other. It's not about what I'm getting out of a relationship or I'm getting out of an activity. It's always about somebody else's condition. And third, it's for their good, which doesn't mean it's always going to be what they want. So every parent understands this intuitively. If you have a child and they're in the kitchen with you while you're cooking and they want to touch the hot stove and they beg and plead, it would make me really happy to touch the hot stove, no parent would allow that to happen because first they understand an objective truth that the child doesn't, that the stove is hot and it will hurt them if they touch it. But second, they will what's best for the child. And so no matter how much they beg and plead, the parent will say no to that because they will what's best for their child. So now we want to pair love with truth. Love without truth can be cruel. Pope Benedict talked about this beautifully. And another common example where we can understand this easily, if you think about anorexia, which is another kind of dysphoria, like gender dysphoria, where someone's mind and their body are not aligned. With an anorexic, they believe with all their mind that they are too thin, even though their body might already, too fat, even though their body might already be too thin and getting thinner. And if you wanted to treat that person with love, you would never encourage them to eat less, to get thinner, to have an operation on their stomachs so that they could consume less food, even though they might think that's what they want. And it's because we will the best for them. And we know what's best for them is not to eat less, but it's to have a healthy body and to align their mind with their body. That's where the importance of truth comes in. Unfortunately, for our young people today, objective, absolute truth is not something that's part of their vocabulary. Maybe it is here at the high school, at Father Gabriel High School, but in many places it is not. For our adolescents, teenagers, young adults, 90% of them ascribe to moral relativism, very different than God's truth. In a moral relativistic viewpoint, everyone has their own opinion of what the truth is, and that's fine. What's true for me is true for me. What's true for you is true for you. And it's kind of a fun philosophy because I don't need to be judgmental about that. If I go off to college and I hold the church's views about life beginning at conception and abortion being wrong, and I meet someone else and they disagree and they think that abortion is fine, that they have the right to control their own body, I don't have to confront them about that because that's their truth and I have my own truth. But moral relativism is a dangerous and depressing philosophy. Depressing because it means that the choices that we make are really irrelevant. If there is no good and there is no evil at a grand scale, it's all just about our personal opinions, then the choices that I make don't matter, and I don't have a future history once I die. Who wants to go through life like that? In addition, it doesn't make any sense because first, we all recognize that there are some truths, like you can't kill, you can't steal, that we all have in common. Even a moral relativist would probably admit that. But moral relativism itself is inconsistent. It's contradictory because it says that it's absolutely true that there is no absolute truth. And if you're a moral relativist, there can't be any absolute truth. So even the premise of that ideology is wrong. And moral relativism never lets us off the hook for doing what is right. And it leads us down paths where we tend to not live out the truth. So for example, if I go to college and I understand the absolute truth that getting intoxicated by drinking too much alcohol is bad for me because I make bad decisions when I do that, but I don't think anybody else has to hold that view, and so I go to parties and I don't look critically on those who get intoxicated every Friday and Saturday night, then eventually when someone offers me a drink, it's not going to seem that bad because it's okay for everybody else. The last thing about moral relativism is that it makes it impossible to have conversations about the things that really matter, things like gender ideology, like abortion, like marriage, and the definition of the human body, what it's supposed to represent, because everything is just a matter of opinion. When I'm talking about abortion, it's like having an opinion about my favorite dessert is chocolate chip cookies. And we know, because the church teaches us, that truth, absolute truth, God's truth, can be ascertained through our logic and our wisdom and through prayer and the teaching of the church, especially the church fathers. And the church has beautiful things to say about the truth of the human body. And so that's the last of the three kind of prefatory subjects that we need to talk about. What does the church think about the human body? And there is no better lesson for the human body than Pope John Paul II's theology of the body. This was 129 weekly addresses that he gave at his papal audiences. It's all been compiled in a book, actually many books with all kinds of commentaries, and it's the best way to understand what our bodies are for. And St. Pope John Paul II starts with the proposition that everything in the universe, every star, every tree, every body, proclaims some truth about its maker, about God. And it's the same way when we think about human created goods. If I'm looking at a fine watch or a ring and I look at the details, or a painting, it tells me something about the person who made it. And so when we look around us at the created world and even at our bodies, it tells us something about God. And so theology of the body is studying God by studying the body. And so St. Pope John Paul II starts all the way back at the beginning in Genesis chapter 1. And God is creating the universe, and he's separating light from darkness and water from land, and he's creating the creatures and the plants and everything else. And at the end of each day of creation, God looks at what he's done, and he declares that it is good, right? And so then finally, the last thing that he does in chapter 1 is he creates man. And when he creates man, he declares that it is very good, right? So already we can see in chapter 1 of Genesis that man is set apart from the rest of creation in a special way. Okay, so now we move to chapter 2 of Genesis. We've been looking at the creation story from a macro view, and now we're going to get very micro on Adam. And so Adam is sitting there, and God sees that he's alone. And for the very first time in this creation narrative, God sees that it is not good, right? Something's wrong. Adam is alone. Now, at first blush, that might seem kind of odd because Adam is surrounded by literally millions of creatures, birds and animals and the creatures of the sea, all this. He's not actually alone, but yet he is alone for the purpose that God created him, which is to be in relationship. He needs a helpmate. Now, we think of helpmate when we read that passage, and sometimes we think of a secretary or a gopher or something like that. And that's part of the root of our sexism in society today, because that's not at all what the Bible is saying. In Hebrew, that word for helpmate is ezer, E-Z-E-R, ezer. And an ezer is someone who is indispensable to helping someone accomplish their goals and who they're supposed to be. God himself is referenced as an ezer 16 times in the Old Testament. So you can immediately see that Eve was not just a helper or a gopher. She was an equal to Adam, someone who is going to help accomplish his purpose. And so God puts Adam to sleep, and Eve is created, and immediately Adam looks at her in her nakedness, and he says, "This at last is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman." So he doesn't say, great, there's been another human created. He's immediately drawn to the body, the humanness of her body. So what is this concept of the flesh of flesh and bone of my bone and the ezer and all that? Well, it's what we were designed for. When God in chapter 1 is about to create man, he says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness." And sometimes we skip over that. We all as Catholics talk about being made in the image and likeness of God. But when God talks about his image and likeness, he uses a plural word, our image, our likeness. It's because God is a community of persons. We know that because of the eternal exchange of love, always willing the best of the other between God the Father and God the Son, Jesus Christ, from them proceeds God the Holy Spirit. God is a community. There are relationships there. And when Adam was sitting there alone in the garden, that's what he was missing. He was not good because he couldn't be in relationship. Now he sees this woman, Eve, and they both understand immediately that they are called to that same eternal exchange of love. At the same time, Adam and Eve would have intuitively noticed that they were not the same. That Eve did not have the same body as Adam, that they were complementary. Now, all of us have a reproductive system, a circulatory system, a muscular system, but that reproductive system, we've only got one half. All the rest of it we can do on our own. But our reproductive system only works when we come together with someone else who has a complementary body. And this is the spousal meaning of the body that John Paul II talks about in the theology of the body. That when a man and a woman come together in a sacramental marriage, and they give everything to each other. They give their emotion, they give their spiritualness, they give their physicalness, and they even give their reproductive capacity. That love is so strong that it needs another name, a son or a daughter. And so now you can kind of put all the pieces together and see what the body's design tells us about God. In the same way that you've got the eternal exchange of love between God the Father and Jesus the Son, God the Son, proceeding from them the Holy Spirit, you've got a husband and a wife, and from them a son or a daughter. Our entire sexuality, the purpose of our bodies, is a mirror, it's an icon of the Trinity itself. How amazing and beautiful is that? And so our very first commission that God gives to Adam and Eve, the very first instruction that he gives to them, is to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. The whole purpose of our bodies is for bonding and procreation. And when a husband and wife come together in sacramental marriage, they become one body. They give everything to each other. That's the spousal meaning of the body. And it then goes on to say that a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. Like that's the whole package right there. That's the purpose of the human body. And it's not just in the Old Testament, in Genesis. Jesus talks about the same thing in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. And St. Paul brings it up as well in his letter to the Ephesians. So anyone who tells you that Jesus and the New Testament never talk about marriage being between one man and one woman, that's a lie, because Jesus describes the exact anthropology that we have in Genesis to describe the way that men and women are complementary and have a spousal purpose. Now, before we talk about what culture thinks about the human body, which is a very different view, I just want to note that as Adam and Eve are standing there naked, they say the Bible says that they were not ashamed. And standing here in 2024, it's kind of hard to imagine any of us standing naked in front of another person that we've just met and not being ashamed. Well, why is that? Well, it's because shame is a natural self-defense against being treated as an object of sexual use. And before the fall, there was no lust in the world yet. And so when Adam and Eve looked at each other in their nakedness, neither one had to worry about what we worry about today, that the other person might treat them as just an object of gratification, as opposed to loving them and always willing what's best for them. And so then, as soon as they disobey God's will and they eat the apple, they listen to the serpent, and now sin comes into the world, immediately they recognize their nakedness and they have to cover up because they're vulnerable now. That eternal plan of love that God had created has been shattered. And that's something that we've been striving to overcome ever since. So the church teaches that we have freedom, but it's not a freedom to do what we want. It's a freedom to do what is right, the freedom to do what we ought. And that's certainly true with the human body. The rest of the world, outside of the church, teaches that freedom is to do whatever selfish desires we have. And that certainly applies to the body. So just briefly, whereas the church teaches that sex is only for a man and a woman in a sacramental marriage, our culture teaches that you can have sex anytime, anywhere, with whomever you want, as long as you have consent and it feels good. The church teaches that to contracept, to withhold the gift of reproductive capacity from your spouse, is sinful. And society teaches, no, contraception is something that you should use to prevent the consequences of having sex anytime, anywhere, with anyone. The church teaches that life begins at conception, that it's sacred and precious and needs to be protected. Culture teaches, well, abortion is the backstop when our contraception doesn't work, and we have to take that baby's life because I wanted to engage in sex without any consequences. The church teaches that marriage is an exclusive bond, just like Jesus said. He kind of went even beyond what Moses said about divorce and said, no, it's impossible to have a divorce. That's not the way that God designed it from the very beginning. Marriage is exclusive and it's permanent, forever. Culture says that marriage doesn't have to be permanent or exclusive. In fact, marriage doesn't even need to be fruitful. That's why you can have a same-sex marriage, because it doesn't matter whether you can procreate and have babies. The church teaches that we're supposed to respect and love others. Culture promotes pornography, which is all about teaching its consumers to treat others like objects of gratification. Masturbation. This is a topic that we don't talk much about in church or even at conferences like these. The church teaches that's wrong because it's not part of the sexual act as part of the marriage, and it's selfish. It's not selfless. Culture teaches that self-pleasure is absolutely fine because you don't need to engage in a relationship with someone else to experience pleasure. You can just do this on your own. And what a terrible message to be sending our young people, our adolescents and teenagers, that they don't have to open themselves up, they don't have to go out and have a relationship with someone else where they care about that person, where they love them by willing their best, because they can have everything they want in the privacy of their own room with a computer. What a horrible thing that we're teaching our society. So where does the cultural teaching lead us? It leads to 63 million innocent lives lost to abortion in the United States alone since Roe versus Wade. It leads to a 50% divorce rate that started shortly after the sexual revolution in the 1960s and has never gotten better. It leads to a marriage rate in the United States which is lower right now than it has been at any time in human history. It leads to fewer children being brought into the world in the United States and in Europe than in any culture in human history. It leads to more out-of-wedlock births on those rare occasions when children are born. It leads to sexual assault, objectification, harassment, low feelings of self-worth, higher depression rates, especially among our young people, higher suicide rates, especially among our young people. We can see that the natural consequences of rejecting God's plan for the body and how we treat each other has horrible consequences, and the result is apparent in the society that we have in the United States today. And what it goes back to is the same problem that Adam and Eve had in the garden. God's will was you can eat anything in the garden, just don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they thought they knew better than God. I'm going to do it my way, not God's way. And it's the same way that our culture teaches people to live today. Do it your way, don't do it God's way. So, with love and truth and the church's understanding of the body as our foundation, we can now start talking about the basics of gender ideology. Now, another foundational idea in St. Pope John Paul II's theology of the body is that we are not merely disembodied souls in a meaningless vessel. We're not souls trapped in shells. And this was not a new insight to John Paul II. This is something that the church has taught for 2,000 years, that we are embodied souls and we are inextricably linked to our bodies. The way Pope John Paul II says it is that the body expresses the person. And again, we all understand this intuitively. If I walked up to one of you and I slapped you in the face, you would not say, "You hurt the vessel that I'm living in." You would say, "You hurt me," because my body is me. And we profess this every Sunday when we say the Nicene Creed, and we talk about how our bodies will eventually be with us in heaven. It's a whole person. Now, I said the church has been teaching this for thousands of years. Why was that necessary? Well, if we go all the way back to the 2nd century, there was a heresy called Gnosticism, which reared its ugly head. And it started because there were some individuals who had a hard time accepting the notion that Jesus arose both body and soul. They could accept the fact that his soul may have arisen after he died. You know, it was a Jewish concept that souls could be with God someday, so that was okay. But the idea that this man who was dead for 3 days would actually come back in his body, that was too much for them to accept. And so some of them developed this idea that we would separate the soul and the body. And it became a movement where the whole purpose of the spiritual life was to get the soul to heaven, and it didn't really matter what happened to the body. And the church said, no, that's absolutely wrong. Our body expresses the soul. They're indivisible. That's the way God created us. We're embodied souls. And this Gnosticism heresy has come back over and over again, and we see it today in the 21st century with gender ideology. So what is this gender identity? The notion is that someone has this internal sense of gender. You know, again, thinking about it in terms of Gnosticism, their soul has a gender, and it expresses itself differently than the sex of the body. So I may be a male biologically, that's my sex, but I could feel like a woman, or maybe part like a woman and a man, or like neither a man or a woman, or something else entirely. And the permutations of those feelings, like all of our feelings, are almost endless. When Facebook was first getting off the ground, they actually had a checkbox on there where you could put your sex or gender. And it started off as just male or female. Well, then they started to add all kinds of other boxes that people could check. And it was half a dozen, and then it was a dozen, and then it was 2 dozen, and it maxed out at about 84 or 88 different gender identities that people could select. And finally they gave up, and they got rid of the box, and they just put a blank there and said, describe your own gender identity. So it can be virtually anything. And so when you hear terms like non-binary, or genderqueer, or two-spirit, these are all different gender identities. Now, gender dysphoria is a very particular kind of gender identity problem. It's a diagnosed mental health illness where a person has a gender identity that is so at odds with their sex that they actually have discomfort and stress from that. And this is a real terrible thing. You know, so this is where we can start talking about the compassion that's important when we're talking about gender ideology. For someone who is suffering from diagnosable gender dysphoria, it's a horrible way to live. I mean, it's similar, akin to anorexia, you know, where those feelings are so strong that it makes it difficult to go out of the house and go to school or go to work every day. And we know, like with many mental health illnesses, that the suicide rates for those who are experiencing gender dysphoria, the diagnosed mental health condition, are much higher than the rest of the population. They need our love, our care, our accompaniment. They also need our truth. Now, I want to distinguish that from what's happened more in the last 5 to 7 years, which is almost like a gender expression contagion, where individuals who might not have that intense feeling of discomfort, they don't have diagnosable dysphoria, but yet they're choosing to express a gender that's different than their sex. And sometimes this will happen in social contagion, where you have a dozen middle school girls all at the same time declare that they're boys. And here, it's not so much that they're trying to avoid the psychological distress, but they're giving into social peer pressure and trying to fit in. And my wife and I were talking on the way here about so much of the way that we raise our kids turns on the positive and negative encouragement or affirmation that we give them. So if our child comes home and they've got a cigarette and we say, "Oh, that's great. Everybody smokes cigarettes. You'll fit in if you do that. I'll buy you a pack." They're going to become a smoker. But if we say, "No, cigarette smoking is going to cause lung cancer. You'll die an early death and terrible things will happen to you. You shouldn't do that and your friends shouldn't either. Here's a book about it," then she'll stop, right? And we have far too many parents who are willing to just give in to those cultural pressures and allow their kids to transition. And as we're going to talk about, and Dr. Roos is going to do a deep dive on this, that the medical consequences for making that kind of choice are absolutely horrible. But before we get there, just kind of sticking with the foundational concepts of gender ideology, so where does this come from? The church has stamped out the idea that our souls and our bodies are somehow inseparable. Well, one of the early proponents was a psychologist in the 1950s. His name was John Money. And it's ironic that his last name was Money because there's so much money in the so-called gender-affirming care industry today when it comes to puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries and things like that. Surgery alone can cost up to $70,000 a procedure, and many insurance policies will cover that now. So John Money had this theory that gender and sex were divisible. And he carried out a number of experiments on young people, and kind of like the pinnacle of that research involved a set of identical twin boys. And unfortunately, one of them, during a circumcision surgery, had irreparable damage done to his genitals. And so the parents didn't know what to do with that poor son. And unfortunately for him, John Money was the person that they approached in asking for a solution to that problem. And so he said, "Well, you need to raise him as a girl." And he thought, all right, now I've got the perfect test subjects. I've got two boys who have the same genetic material. They're identical twins, one being raised as a boy, one being raised as a girl. And so he watched them grow up, declared that it was a success, that your gender identity was different from your sex because the girl grew up fine. And that was the basis of modern psychology pushing gender ideology. Well, what he didn't tell people was that he forced those young kids to engage in sexual acts. And he photographed that and did all kinds of horrible experiments on them. And when the boy who had been transitioned into a girl complained about that publicly as he got older, John Money immediately pushed back and said that he just hated trans people. Does that sound familiar? Well, eventually the boy who had been transitioned to a girl committed suicide. The whole thing was a disaster, and it is no basis whatsoever to conclude that somehow the mind and the body are different. And as Dr. Roos will tell you, there is not one medical study anywhere in the world that establishes that there's such a thing as a boy trapped in a girl's body or a girl trapped in a boy's body. It doesn't exist. And there's no scientific test that can identify whether someone is transgender. It's all in the head. It's subjective, and it's a feeling that it's professed. Now, the church explains, because of this unity of body and soul, that our sex is biological and it's immutable. It's reality. So as a result, our sex is determined at conception. That's the point where we have our chromosomes, XX or XY. It is not assigned at birth, which is the modern way to talk about it. People will say that doctors will assign a boy baby a boy sex, but we don't know if that's really their sex until they grow up and they tell us. And gender activists will tell us that even at 10 or 11 months old, if your baby girl is pulling a barrette out of her hair, that she's trying to tell you that she's a boy. Right, we all laugh, but that was actually in an AP article about 6 years ago, reported as a fact. It's absolutely ridiculous. We understand that moms and dads, because of their different sexes, are different, that brothers and sisters are different. Now that said, we can express our sexuality in different ways. There's nothing wrong with a girl who wants to play sports, or who is really interested in the stock market or woodworking, stereotypical boy activities. In the same way that there's nothing wrong with a boy who wants to do domestic stuff, likes to play with dolls, is really sensitive and is into emotions, likes to cook in the kitchen. If you would draw a bell curve of stereotypical behavior by boys and girls, you would find that there is a lot of overlap all the way out to the ends. But just because a girl likes to engage in stereotypical boy activities doesn't mean that she's a boy. Just because a boy likes to engage in stereotypical girl activities doesn't mean that he's a girl. It just means that they express their male and female sexuality a little bit differently. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's something true about that with clothing too. It's a cultural construct. People forget that back in the early 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, pink was the preferred color for boys because it was considered a strong color, and blue was considered the color for girls because it was a weaker color. Isn't that funny? And today we think about it the exact opposite way. So just because we have these things, the way that we express our sexuality differently, doesn't change that every cell in our body is coded male or female. That our brain is one of the most sexed organs of the body. And I'm sure Dr. Ruse will talk about that too. And nor does it change that our complementary bodies were designed to be part of God's plan. And that when we reject that, we reject the Trinity, we reject the spousal meaning of the body, and we reject God's truth. So how could we possibly be in a place today where in some states, nearly 10% of our young people, adolescents and teenagers, identify as transgender? Think about that, 10%. And it's because we're still in the garden eating the apple. It's all about that self-determination, that I don't have to follow God's will, I can follow my own will. And if I want to feel more like a girl than a boy, I can change and modify my body any way that I want to make that happen. And what's horrible about that, besides rejecting God's will, just whatever I feel, I can make it real is the concept, is that it also relies on gross stereotypes about what it feels like to be the opposite sex. So an 11-year-old boy has no idea what it feels like to be a girl. The only thing he has to go on are the stereotypes that he sees in culture about what girls wear and the activities that girls engage in. And he says, oh, well, if I want to be a girl, then I can do those same things. And that really doesn't have anything to do with what it means to be a female, what it means to be a woman. And the whole philosophy, like moral relativism, is hypocritical and self-contradicting. Because gender ideologists say that our bodies don't matter when it comes to gender ideology. Our sex is assigned at birth, we can decide whatever it is that we want. But at the same time, as these kids get older, they say we have to change their bodies in order to conform with their identity. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So Bishop Carlson here in the United States has talked about 3 philosophies that undergird the transgender movement that as Catholics we have to absolutely reject. The first is that feelings define our identity. That's not true. If I feel like someone who likes to smoke, that doesn't make me a smoker. I mean, even though I practice as a lawyer, I might feel like a lawyer, that doesn't define my identity. I am not a lawyer. I'm someone who practices law. Our identity is as a son or daughter of God. And you have to get that identity right first, and then everything else works out. The second thing the bishop says is that culture's philosophy is that human integrity means acting on our desires rather than God's plan. And that's the whole apple in the garden. That instead of following God's will, even if that's hard, that's ultimately what I'm made to do. That's how I'm going to flourish as a human person. That's how I'm going to be the best possible person that I can be. Instead, I should just do whatever I feel and I desire. If I see the apple, I can take it. If I want to abuse someone else and take advantage of their body, I can do that. If I want to change mine, I can do that too. We categorically have to reject that. The third philosophy that underlies the transgender movement is that anyone who doesn't affirm that mistaken philosophy hates trans people. And nothing can be farther from the truth. You know, again, going back to Pope Francis and what he said at the conference just yesterday, he's someone who cares very deeply for the transgender community, has spent time with them, has exhibited love for them, wants what's best for them, but at the same time can truthfully say that the ideology is ugly and needs to be abolished because it takes away our human differences. And Pope Francis has spoken forcefully about this in encyclicals and in some of his addresses about how endorsing gender ideology violates our two great commandments. What are those? Love of God and love of neighbor, right? I mean, the whole law and the prophets can all be boiled down to that. Well, when we reject our sex, we're rejecting a gift from God, the way that he created us. And so we're breaching that relationship with our Creator, the same way that Adam and Eve did. That violates the first commandment. In addition, when we deny our identity as a son or daughter of God, we're pretending to be someone else. And when we do that, we can't enter into authentic relationships with other people. If I was meeting someone for the first time and I gave them a fake name and a fake profession and fake details about my family life, I wouldn't be able to have any kind of an authentic relationship with them because they can't relate to who I really am. And so gender ideology breaks the second commandment as well. And in the book, if you have a chance to look at it, I've got all these wonderful passages from Pope Francis and also some of the many wonderful statements, pastoral letters from our U.S. bishops who speak beautifully about this. Now, briefly, with the couple minutes I have left, I just want to tee up at a 10,000-foot level some of the scientific concepts that Dr. Roos is going to be deep diving on. First, as I mentioned, there's no study that establishes that someone is born in the opposite sex's body. There's no laboratory test that can tell us that. What gender ideology is a dysphoria in the mind. Now, there are other dysphorias. We mentioned anorexia, body integrity disorder or body dysmorphia is another one. That's where someone has this intense feeling that their arm or their nose or their ear doesn't belong on their bodies, and they might even take physical steps to try to remove that. It's noteworthy that of all the dysphorias, every single one except for one, the psychologists and the doctors will urge the person to align their mind with their body, to align their mind with reality, not the other way around. Gender ideology is the only one where they encourage someone to align their body with the mind. And so it shouldn't be surprising to us that when we follow that mistaken path, as a matter of science as well as a matter of our Catholic faith, which of course are always aligned, there are terrible consequences. When kids take puberty blockers to stop themselves from going into puberty until they figure out whether they're a boy or a girl and then they can take other steps, that increases mental health issues. There's a recent study from the UK on that very topic. That taking puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in the adolescent and teenage years will increase brain difficulties, heart problems, loss of bone density. It starts to lead to infertility and loss of sexual function. And then when you get to the adults, we have long-term studies from Europe, which Dr. Roos will talk about in detail. They show that adults who have gone through a full transition, that the suicide rates and the mental health problems actually go up. So sometimes as parents or grandparents, we hear that it's better to have a live son than a dead daughter, or vice versa. That's a lie. Transitioning someone will actually make those mental health problems worse and result in these horrible outcomes. The part that's really frustrating is that kids who are expressing possible gender dysphoria, identifying as a transgender, that 85% of them, if they're just left alone, will naturally align their mind with their body. And as I mentioned before, there's no scientific test that tells us ahead of time who's going to have dysphoria. So 85% of these kids, when you give them affirmation, pronouns, clothing, opposite sex bathrooms, sports teams, and then the drugs and things like that, you're pushing them down a path. That social affirmation like we were talking about, like giving your kids the pack of cigarettes, you're pushing them down a path. 94% of them will persist in their trans identity if they're affirmed. So all these kids in schools, we're setting them up. And sometimes Catholics will talk to me about these issues, but what about the pronouns? I mean, what would Jesus do? At a minimum, can I call someone their preferred pronoun and their preferred name because that's how they identify themselves? Isn't that just being respectful and loving? And no, it's like saying, oh, that's good, here's a pack of cigarettes. You're pushing them into the 94% category that are going to have problems instead of the 85% category that will naturally align their minds with their bodies and go on and have healthy lives. So we can't give in on the pronouns. We can't do it. So last thought is just to be careful as parents and grandparents with the type of social media and television and movies that your kids are consuming. Because you might not have any idea what is being fed to them. On TikTok, on Instagram, all these other social media platforms, there are tens of thousands of hours of trans promotion. And they would just love to have your kid get sucked into that, because as soon as they do, they're going to connect it online or with kids at school who are going to embrace them and tell them how great this is, that they've discovered their true self. They're going to get their positive affirmation from someone else. But it's not just when the kids get their cell phones, which I encourage you to keep away from your kids, that and social media, as long as you possibly can. Our household rule was no smartphones till you were a driver, and no social media until you went to college. They didn't always like that at the time, but they thank us for it now. But be careful with your little kids too. Blue's Clues, some of you as parents may know that show. Our kids watched it when they were little. It's targeted for 3, 4, 5-year-olds. It's part cartoon, part live action. And 3 years ago, during Pride Month, they had a pride parade on Blue's Clues, and every float promoted a different aspect of the LGBTQ agenda. One of those floats had a family of beavers on it, and there was a little girl beaver, and she had X's of tape across her breasts. It was because she had had a breast removal. And in case there was any doubt about that, they asked the producers of the show, and they said, oh yes, that's what we're trying to teach kids. So if you put down your son or daughter in front of Blue's Clues for a couple of minutes so that you could get a load of laundry done or close your eyes for 5 minutes, that's what they could be exposed to. So as parents, we need to be hyper vigilant. We also need to approach this issue with the utmost of love and compassion possible. Just like anybody in our family who's suffering from a mental health issue or some other life issue, we don't walk away, or put a hand up and create a wall in that relationship. We lean into it. We accompany. As Catholics, we're called to be the hands and feet of Christ. And so it's our job to get educated. I'm glad that you're all here today. I hope when you go away from this conference, you read my book, you read Dr. Roos's book, and that you spread this gospel message to other people. But then we engage. And that if you've got a son or daughter, a granddaughter, a niece or nephew, that you're talking to them about these issues so that they're inoculated against all the terrible messages that culture is trying to teach them. Conversations about sex and the body are hard, but we're called to do that. Last point is I don't want you to be discouraged by this or anything else that you're going to hear today. There are absolutely terrible things happening in our culture today, but terrible things have been happening in our human culture going all the way back to Adam and Eve. If you ever get depressed, open up the Bible and look at the Old Testament. This is what my wife reminds me. Whether it's killing babies, worshiping false idols, not understanding the purpose of the human body, the spousal idea of the body, all these things, we've tried this a million times, it's failed a million times, and it's going to keep happening. And as Catholics, we're going to be persecuted for speaking the truth. Jesus promised that. But this is what we've been called to do, and this is our moment. We've all been placed in this particular time, in this particular culture, so that we can speak into it and we can save people for Christ. And I can't imagine something to be more excited about and more optimistic about than that. Thank you.